Hello and welcome to this home learning video where we're going to be looking at language paper 1 question 5. You'll need a question sheet that looks like this. You can do this electronically, you can do it by hand. I'd encourage you to try and do it by hand because of course many of you will have to do this by hand in the exam. You'll need a pen, you might need some lined paper, or you can use the back of this as well. So we're just going to go over language paper 1 question 5 today. So first thing to know, just looking quickly at the mark scheme really, what we tend to find with students doing language paper 1 question 5 is that most of you, remember, you get a mark out of 24 for your content and organisation and a mark out of 16 for your technical accuracy. Most students tend to come in with a mark of between 7 and 18 for their content, whether, whatever you're writing. Some successful communications or some good attempts at it, or consistent clear communication, are quite easy to achieve on this mark scheme, I think, really. And getting into those top bands, it's about thinking about what you're going to write. It's about being compelling and convincing, basically thinking like a writer, getting your reader to engage with what you're writing and creating the things that they're doing. Some people, I know in some schools they say do question 5 first, but actually we always tell you to do questions 1, 2, 3 and 4 first, because what you start to understand, question 2 where you're analysing language at the start, question 3 where you're analysing structure, and question 4 where you're thinking about how good a writer has been at creating a sense of something, they all prepare you for this question where you've got to do a piece of your own writing as well. And really, for top marks, what we need to do is think about, convincing and compelling communication, clear tone, style and register match to the audience. You're thinking about your audience and what you want them to think or feel. You're using ambitious vocabulary throughout. You're using cleverly structural features, and you've got paragraphs with discourse markers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So what you need to do if you're going to aiming for these top bands is really to think about what effect you want to create on your reader over the whole piece, but also in each paragraph. And then the other thing to note is you're marked out of 16 for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. Students often tend to think about them thing we see, and actually I wouldn't say necessarily that spelling is the worst thing here. To get a mark of 8 out of 16, some control, some use, attempts, some accurate spelling. So you can make quite a few mistakes and still come out with half marks really. For the bands above, you can still mostly with success. So basically what an examiner will do is they'll look at your whole piece of writing and they'll think, right, have they got more right than they've got wrong? Have they got most of things right and actually they've just made a couple of mistakes here, and they'll probably put you in level 3. But to get in level 4, consistently accurate, wide range of punctuation used, high level of accuracy, full range of appropriate sentence forms for effect, standard English consistently, secure control of complex grammatical structures, high level accuracy in spelling, extensive and ambitious use of vocabulary. And starting to think about your vocabulary and your spelling there, it's thinking about words you can use, but also words you can use to have an effect, tying back in with what we said before. So that's the mark scheme. We'll look at that at several points throughout this video. First thing to do then is look at the task. So obviously it's on this section. It says write in full sentences. You're reminded that you need to plan your answer and leave enough time to check your work at the end. So I would be saying you're kind of going to be talking about 5 to 10 minutes plan, and you need to do that as well. Looking at the year 11 trial exams, there are a lot of students not planning at all, and I hate to kind of use this this phrase, but it's true. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. If you're going to miss out such an important process that all writers do, thinking about what goes in there, you're going to start rushing and you're going to write and write and write. You're going to repeat yourself. You're going to lose steam. You're probably going to be leaving about 5 minutes to check at the end. Just check you've made no silly spelling mistakes. If you're unsure about how to spell something, use that time to think about, have I got that right? Should that be a comma or a semicolon? And then obviously that gives you, let's say, 10 minutes there, 5 there, 5 there. That gives you 35 minutes to write. You're probably looking for 2 to 3 sides of quality. That depends on your handwriting. Obviously, if you've got enormous handwriting, you're probably going to write maybe a little bit more than that 3 sides. But as a rough guide, 2 to 3 sides of quality. If you're writing much more than that, you could be at risk of kind of not getting into those top bands, or even into even into band 4, where we're talking about clear and consistent. Because if you write lots and lots and lots and lots and lots, and it's actually all of the same standard, or potentially of a worse standard at various points, you're going to lose that concision. You're going to not get into those top bands. So the question here we've got you to think about is your local newspaper is running a creative writing competition and they intend to publish the winning entries. This statement gets you to think about who you're writing for. You're writing for your local newspaper. You can imagine it's the Barnsley Chronicle if you want to, but it's clear here we are writing for adults. Doesn't matter who we're writing for. This basically reminds us we need to write in standard English, and we're technically writing for a creative writing competition, so we should be trying to make what we're writing as engaging as possible. You know, we're not just trying to describe something for the sake of it, we're trying to win a competition. There's not really a competition. Obviously AQA use this as a bit of a kind of a ploy just to get you to write really, really well. We're going to look at the different kind of approaches to each question, but you get a choice. Here it's a choice between either describe a journey by bus as suggested by this picture, or write a story about two people from very different backgrounds. So you've got a choice between a descriptive task and a story, or what we call a narrative task. Sometimes you might get two descriptive tasks, sometimes you might get two narratives. In all the exams we've seen so far, it's been one of each. Normally there is a picture attached. There doesn't always have to be, but we'll talk about that when we look at the descriptive task. Then what you need to think about is your plan. So there are some absolute things that you should include, whether you are thinking about doing the story, whether you're thinking about doing the description. The first thing I'm doing a plan, I always make a simple list of all the bits of punctuation that I could possibly include, just as a little kind of memory aid to include them. I'm now trying to frantically check that I've got them all here. Pretty happy that I've got the main ones anyway. Some of them we'd expect you to use full stops and capital letters. You'd be amazed about people even in high sets who aren't using full stops and capital letters for proper nouns. I've had quite a few of those in the trial exams. Exclamation marks, question marks, speech marks. We're not saying you have to use these things. You know, if it doesn't need it, you don't have to. These particular are quite basic bits of punctuation, but if you need to, use them and use them accurately. Commas, I put a ×2 there because there's two ways you can use them. In a list, which is the kind of primary school way, in inverted commas of remembering them, but also to demark a subordinate clause, or a complex sentence. And of course, thinking back to our mark scheme, if we're looking at using, a range of structural features, that's where your complex sentences come in there as well. Sentence types for SPAG. Apostrophes for possession, so somebody owns something or has something or does something. And please bear in mind as well that we've got a picture of a bus here. Buses can possess things even though they're not actually real people, so if you're talking about the bus's wheels, you need an apostrophe. And also obviously for missing letters, cannot, can't, etc. Semicolons and commas, I think we'll look at semicolons in a minute, but you've got two related ideas. And relate with the semicolon. People often refer to them as being replaced by and. We cover these in class kind of nearer the time as well, but you'd be surprised by the number of times that students use it. They write a sentence and they write another sentence that's related to that thing and they put a comma in the middle, and actually it should be a semicolon. The other one I've kind of drawn here is a dash. A dash is a really useful kind of piece of punctuation. We're not talking about hyphens to separate two words. If you're in any doubt, a dash can do the job of a comma and a semicolon. It can do the job of a few of these bits of punctuation here. So if you're unsure, put a dash. And I've seen a growing trend in students doing this, and it's actually quite a clever way to kind of get yourself out of a tricky situation. You need to be careful about using them all the time because your work starts to look like an Emily Dickinson poem. But yeah, just be mindful that dashes can actually be quite useful there as well. The other thing I include, and I do this because I've yet to see a year 11 student who's mastered paragraphing, is a reminder of paragraphs. Tip top. Time, place, topic, and person. Every time in a piece of writing you change the focus, whether that is you change the place, so you might be outside and when you get on the bus, that needs a new paragraph. Every time you change person, so if you're talking about yourself and you go to talk about one of these people on the bus, that needs a new kind of a new paragraph. Every time you're changing time, so if you're talking about, I was walking to the bus and when I got on the bus, you're going to have to start the next thing with a new paragraph. If you're flashing back or forward, if you're using an ellipsis, that you can use kind of a new paragraph there, and you should use a new paragraph. The confusion comes, I think, because sometimes we tell you to write 4 paragraphs about 4 bits of this picture, let's say, if you're doing the descriptive. But actually, if you look at novels, if you look at the texts we study in literature, perhaps not Frankenstein, some huge paragraphs in there, but actually, and obviously think about the time period that was written, modern novels change and have kind of more paragraphs than you'd think. So while we tell you to write about 4 things and maybe write 4 paragraphs, obviously within that you're probably going to be writing lots and lots of different paragraphs if you're kind of changing the focus here as well. The final thing I'd get you to do, just a simple one, just think about your sentence starters. These are simple kind of wins. Just a little note here. Past participle, ed, quite often is the ending of that, not always. Present participle, ing, and ly, fronted adverbial. These are things that you need to include in your writing to develop the quality of that. You should be aiming to start your sentences, particularly if you're writing a story, not with I or the or an or he or she or it, depending on your narrative voice. You know, frustrated, comma, I crept onto the bus. Throwing my bag down on the chair, comma, the lady next to me turned around in shock. Suddenly, comma, the bus skidded to a halt. You know, those sorts of things. They're better than the, an, he, she, I, you know, and so on and so forth as well. So use them as much as you possibly can. It's one of the quickest wins, and it's mentioned in the mark scheme again because we class them as discourse markers at the start of paragraphs. So that is a kind of a list of things that I'd include for everything. You can include on here, you know, similar, do this as well, adjectives, just as a little reminder. You don't have to, because I think sometimes the danger is if you write down just a list of, oh, I've got to have a simile, got to have a metaphor, what we get is we get rubbish similes and rubbish metaphors, and I don't mean to be rude there, but you know, it's true. We get people that, oh, I must include a simile to describe this picture, and so they get things like, the bus was as hot as the sun. And the problem with that is it's a cliche. You know, everyone thinks, oh, what's hot? Well, the bus is hot and the sun's hot, so I'll call it as hot as the sun. And the problem with doing that is you actually diminish the quality of your work. So I don't tend to do that, but I know some people do. If you'd like. What you might want to do is write down some vocabulary here as well, particularly if you know you struggle with your spelling and you've spent, you know, about 10-15 minutes, let's say, or the night before the exam you've been revising, or throughout the year you've been revising 10, if you like, good words to describe or 10 bad words to describe, and so on and so forth. You might want to just kind of jot these down here. So you might have things like, you know, there's an eerie silence on the bus and so on and so forth, making sure you spelt them correctly. You might want to include things like the 5 senses. So you've got see, smell, touch, taste, and hear. Just so you've got, you know, whether you're telling the narrative or you are describing the bus, you've got some detailed things that you can actually describe. You're not just telling me what we can see, which is the obvious one. You're kind of adding sensory description to your description or to a character in your narrative or an event in your narrative. So what we're going to do now is we're going to think about the descriptive task here as well. So the descriptive task says here, describe a journey by bus as suggested by this picture. If you've got a picture, it will always have this as suggested by, which basically means that you don't have to describe this picture person for person, blow for blow. You can, you know, if you want to have a bus from school in daytime, this looks like a bus in London at night time, that's fine. As suggested by is basically, we're giving you a bus, we're giving you some people, we're giving you some lights, we're giving you London. You know, you're describing, you're not telling us a story about London or this person, how they got on the bus. You're describing what it would be like to be in that situation. If you want to do a train or a car, that's absolutely fine. I mean, I know it says a journey by bus there, so I suppose you keep it to bus if you can, really. But it will always say as suggested by. You won't lose marks if you kind of do any of the other bits and pieces, or if you go off topic as well. You know, it doesn't mention anywhere in the mark scheme write about a bus. It doesn't mention anywhere, you know, it's got to be at night time. Obviously it mentions purpose and audience, but the purpose is just a piece of engaging creative writing, so don't worry too much about, you know, the formalities there as well. If you're doing a descriptive task, what we would get you to do is probably look at 4 things you could describe in detail, and when you're describing them, approach it as a case of you want to have an impact on the reader, and you probably want to think about where you're starting and where you're ending. You probably want to think about your structure of your piece of writing. One of the things that I would have then is I would probably start by describing, I'm just going to draw a box around it here, the outside. That's my first piece of description, paragraph if you want to call it, a section of my piece of writing is probably a better word because it may take up more than one paragraph, as we talked about before. And I'm going to describe two things in detail. I am going to try and keep to this picture as much as I can. I'm going to describe the darkness, and in your planning time, 5 to 10 minutes, and take 10 minutes if you want to plan out what you want to say. I want you to think about what you could say about that darkness. You know, think about nouns you could use to describe, think about this idea that darkness could be menacing. It's going to be quite cold out there, it's going to be icy potentially. I'm not thinking of particularly good adjectives, I apologise for that now, but what I will say is, you know, think about it, you can kind of come up with these as well. I might use my kind of word eerie as well. You know, I know it looks quite busy on the street, I'm guessing at Oxford Circus maybe in London, but I'm going to pretend that there's just me there. I'm going to get rid of these people outside because it says suggested by, and I can do that. The next thing I'm going to do as part of this paragraph is, so I've got the darkness, and as well as it being kind of cold and icy and eerie, I've actually got all these kind of fluorescent light. We've got Ripley's Believe It or Not, we've got all these kind of lights, and I'm not actually on the bus at this point, but I've got this idea of a neon jungle. I've got the lights, I've got kind of flashing, I've got this idea that these lights are invading. It could go as far as burning my eyes potentially. I'm going to hold stuff, I'm not going to go that far, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this is as hostile as possible. So between the coldness and the darkness outside of the bus and all these lights flashing in my eyes, burning, and you notice I'm just writing adjectives and nouns here as well. You know, I've got the kind of reds and yellows. I'm not saying, oh, burning like the sun here, because to be honest, that simile might not be appropriate, and I don't think it is appropriate. I think it's quite a simple simile really, and I might not even think of a good simile, but I'll tell you what, I can think about, oh, these lights are invasive, they're burning, they're hostile. Think about the effects you want to create before you actually think about what you want to use to create those effects. So the next thing I'm going to describe is I'm going to describe getting on this bus. So I've been outside. I might start this paragraph with, as I was waiting for the bus, or stood at the bus stop, you know, thinking about my sentence openers down here, comma, and then go into it there, and then talk about the lights and the darkness. So my second paragraph, as I finally got on the bus, or exhausted after an eternity of waiting, comma, the bus pulled in, and then as I got on the bus, and I'm going to describe the inside of the bus. So I've got here, and I'm not going to go for the people, I'm going to go for all the bits and pieces inside the bus. And the effect I'm going to go for here, I'm going to make it hostile again. I'm going to make this is not a very nice journey to be on. I'm not, no offence public transport fans, but I'm not a massive public transport fan, I must say. Don't mind it every now and again. I've been on a London bus many a time, and there's nothing worse when you get on a bus and it's cramped, and I'm going to make my bus cramped. Here we've got about 7 people on the bus, probably overestimated that. This bus is full, so it's full, it's sweaty, it's hot, I suppose, you know. People are crushing together, and I'm not going to use crushing together like sardines, or I use cliched similes. There's just crushing at the moment. You know, I might think of a better simile here as well. I'm going to think of the seats here as well. This is still my second paragraph. So the seats are grimy, they're dirty, they're filthy. There's chewing gum on them as well. So in my piece of writing, I might have that sensation where finally, in a new paragraph, finally, comma, I spied the salvation of a free seat. Lowering my exhausted frame into the seat, my hand recoiled in horror as it was glued to the seat by some regurgitated chewing gum. You know, I might use simile or metaphor there as well. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to be creative, and all these things I'm trying to make it hostile. I'm trying to make you disgusted by this bus. I'm not saying the bus was disgusting. I'm trying to make you feel disgusted by being on this bus. Then what I might want to do for my third paragraph or my third section is I'm going to describe a person. I'm going to describe this young lady here. She, looking at her face, she looks a little bit worried. She's on her face. I want you as my reader to see her anxiety. She's upset. There are tears. Her phone, so she is blubbing. Maybe not particularly good words. Sobbing down the phone. You know, maybe her cries fill the carriage. Oh, it's a train, not a carriage. Sorry, a bus, not a carriage. But either way, you know, she might not. You know, she might be talking to her friend about something really, really fun. But I'm going to make sure that she is upset in my bus, because that's what I want to do for my piece of description. And then for my fourth paragraph, I'm not actually going to be on the bus anymore. I'm going to get off the bus. I mean, I'm not surprised after the first couple of paragraphs. I'm going to get off the bus. I'm going to go into the darkness, but this time this darkness is a relief to me. It's not menacing, it's not cold, it's icy, it's eerie, it's comforting, you know, a blanket that envelops me. I mean, I can use it. I know it's a bit of a cliche that, but I'm going to use it because in my final paragraph, I'm going to see home. On my final section, I'm going to see home. I've left the lights on, and unlike the lights here, it's warm, it's cozy, it's inviting, and I'm going to end my piece of description with me putting the kind of the key in the front door, and maybe just a simple one word paragraph to end, home. And that is my piece of descriptive writing. The techniques I use, you notice I've not really mentioned the word simile, metaphor, adjectives, adverbs, because I've got enough to describe here, and as I'm writing that I can think what would work best there. What, you know, similes, if you're using similes and they're cliched, like a sun, you know, the light was as bright as the sun, you know, the dark was like a blanket. Try not to use cliches in your writing. It's probably not the best idea. You don't need a simile at all. Nowhere in the mark scheme does it say, you know, if you use 20 similes, you get 24 out of 20. It's kind of is my advice there as well. So the next thing we're going to focus on is the narrative piece. Write a story about two people from very different backgrounds. A lot of people will see this, and I know a lot of English teachers, we say do the description, do the description, do the description, because the description fits nicely into 2 to 3 sides. We generally speaking see marks higher for description rather than narrative, and I think that's because we as people are very, very good at sharing narratives. We're good at telling stories, whether that's what happened in an English lesson, whether it's what you've done at the weekend, whether it's where you've been on holiday. But actually those stories aren't necessarily engaging, they aren't necessarily concise, they go on for longer than 2 to 3 sides, as we've kind of talked about here as well. And actually that's where you start to not lose marks as such, but you certainly lose concision. And when you lose concision, you lose the chance of getting good marks. The other thing with stories is stories tend to be, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, or he did this. A good story, you know, a good piece of fiction will have description, and you need to make sure that if you're writing a story, it must include some description. Character is probably the easiest thing to do, but you could also do feeling or emotion. Think about the text that you've read for section A, because that will have characters described, that will have feelings described as well, and they're the things you probably need to describe in your story. Here we've got a story about two people from very different backgrounds. The danger with this is that you come up with something that's cliched. There are about 500,000 students who do GCSE every year. Of the people, let's say half of them pick to do this narrative task. Of the 250,000 doing that, I'd imagine 200,000 are thinking, oh well, me and my best friend are from very different backgrounds because they like this and I like this, and we didn't really get on at primary school, and oh, it was great, and yeah, you know, and now we're best friends and nothing's going to tear us apart. And of course the problem with that is it's all just very, very cliche. It's not particularly compelling or convincing. You know, it might be a good story, but it's not going to be a Hollywood blockbuster, and you know, your examiner, it might not even really be clear as well. The first thing I get you to think about then, if you're doing this task, I'm going to plan this on the back of the sheet, is that what you need to do is think about who you're actually going to write about. So who are your people from very different backgrounds that would be engaging? Let me have a little think. So the first one I kind of mentioned there is kind of friends. at school. I don't really like that one. Football, you know, I'm an Everton fan. My friends at school were Liverpool fans, but even despite our differences, we were still kind of, you know, with different backgrounds, we were kind of friends, and isn't that great? You know, again, it's not particularly compelling or exciting. Maybe potentially something like race or ethnic background. So you might have, you could not retell the story of, but kind of use things like, you know, the ideas of kind of in America, you've got protesters, the police. That's the one that I might do, I think, for this narrative, and you could put an ethnic angle to that as well. You've got potentially social class. You could think about kind of issues, so you could have a climate change, protester versus a politician. You could have something like a criminal versus a victim. You could have potentially inmates, in prison. It's up to you, but what you need to do is you need to think about your ideas. Don't just write the first thing that comes into your head. You need to plan. You need to plan the basics. You need to write this as a kind of little tool to remind you, and you need to plan like we've done here as well. So if you're writing a story, it's the exact same thing. Don't just plan, or don't just start writing, because you will miss out on valuable marks, because you'll start and think, oh, I'm going to talk about me and my best mate, or oh yeah, Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United fans arguing, or Barnsley fans arguing, Wednesday United fans, and you'll write something you think is good, and you'll lose all concision there as well, and you'll lose that engagement. So the thing that I'm going to probably focus on is this idea of protesters versus police. I'm not going to link it to race. I might kind of link it to climate change as well. So I'm going to you need a setting. I'm going to set it in a riot, probably on the streets of London as well. I'm not going to mention London in too much detail, but I'm going to mention the riot there as well. And let's just keep it simple. Character 1 is going to be a student. He's going to be mild-mannered. He's going to be young. He's going to be intelligent. He is going to be kind of, if you like, his kind of family hero, I suppose. You know, his family idolise him, and he's the only one to go to university. Character 2 is going to be a police officer. A riot police officer. He's going to be kind of older. I've made them both male as well, actually. There's nothing, you know, it doesn't matter what gender you make them really, but I've just gone for kind of male here as well. I know it's a bit stereotypical, I apologise for that. Police officer, he's old, he's kind of close to retirement. I'm guessing he probably wouldn't be a riot officer, but, you know, it's my story. And mild-mannered as well. He has the opposite political view to our student here. So let's say we're going to make this about climate change. You know, he doesn't believe that climate change is a problem, but our student believes that they are. But they're from similar kind of backgrounds as well. Then what I need to do is plan out what happens in the beginning, the middle and the end of my story. And these terms should be familiar because it's the exact same thing you've analysed for question 3. You are now doing question 3, you're structuring your own narrative. So in the beginning of my story, I'm probably going to have a protester go into protest. I might describe the streets of London as calm. I might not have time to do all this in the kind of 35 minutes I've got to write. I'm going to describe the sense of excitement. You know, they're going to protest, they've got their banners. There's a kind of calm atmosphere as well, and they're excited because they think they're going to make a change there to the situation. And then something kind of goes wrong in my middle, but before I get to my middle, kind of halfway between the two, I'm going to describe a police officer. He's calm as well. You know, I'm not having someone being overly aggressive yet, but he's calm, he's mild. And what he's going to be doing in this situation is he's going to be kind of waiting for the end of his shift, just wanting the protest to pass without incident. I might have him checking his watch every so often. I might have him just looking at people and going, oh, phew, thank heavens, you know, there's a wife with children there. And then somewhere in the middle of my story, something is going to go wrong. Keeping political, maybe one of the protesters throws a stone. So now these things tend to start. So this is kind of my middle. One of the protesters throws a stone. I'm not going to use something daft like onomatopoeia with the word banging, because I know that sounds creative, but again, it's a bit of a cliche. One of the protesters throws a stone, and then gradually we descend into a riot. There is fire. There are going to be people fighting. And we've got our police officer and our protester, both mild, both calm people, caught up in the middle of this. You know, I've got kind of maybe a police baton charge at the protesters. I'd like to say as well, obviously I'm not saying that would happen necessarily, but let's just say there is here in my story is a baton charge at the protesters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this with my student on the floor holding a rock or some kind of weapon in self-defense, and I'm going to end it with him locking eyes on the police officer with his baton raised, ready to strike. And I'm not going to say, and then they started beating each other up with the rock and the baton. I'm just going to leave it there. You know, the last line is probably going to be, you know, and the police officer raised his baton in the sky, and that's it. You know, or the kind of the glimmers of the sunlight bounced off the end of the baton as it was held aloft into the sky. I'm not going to end it with anything particularly aggressive or nasty happening. I'm just going to leave it there, and you as my reader, you are going to fill in the gaps. You are going to tell me not what happens next, I suppose, but you can probably guess what happens next. I'm going to play on that as a writer. So when you're ending your stories, don't just end it with, and then we all went home and had jelly and ice cream for tea, as we see some things happen. Think about a creative ending. And I've not mentioned this in the video, but I've thought about that ending when I knew I was going to write about a protester. I thought that I'm not going to have the usual cliche of, oh, someone gets beaten up and the police officer gets upset and this thing. I'm just going to end it with that. They might end peacefully, and you could subvert that. You could have them going off peacefully. You could have whatever ending you want, but think about what you're going to put in your narrative. So what we want you to do is we want you to do three things. We want you to plan either a descriptive or narrative piece. I'd encourage you to do the narrative. I think it's important to build your narrative skills. We want you to write the opening and final paragraph of your descriptive or narrative piece. So you're going to have a plan that looks either something like this or something like this, and that's what we'll be checking for. And then we want to see your opening paragraph, so whether that's describing a student or describing a bus or the night, and then a final paragraph which is going to be, you know, what happens at the end of your description. And think about the impact, because that is where you tend to get your reader, I hate this term, but you get your reader hooked. You know, present an interesting impact, make us kind of feel sad or sorrow, or, you know, feel calm at the start, and then how do we feel at the end as well. And we're looking forward to reading your piece of writing too.